What is going on, everybody? Welcome back into another episode of the Celtics Talk Weekly podcast. I am your host, Rob Haytan. Joined with me are two very familiar faces on this podcast and to this channel, Franco and the man Xavier. Guys, thank you so much for joining us in. Should be a fun one today.
Looking forward to it. Great game we had last night.
Excited to be back, guys. Let's do it.
Now, before I get started, guys, I say this at the beginning of every podcast. I'm going to say it again. If you're not following us on our social medias, go do that right now. All of our links to everything related to the Celtics Talk Weekly and to our individual accounts will be linked down below in the description. If you're watching this on YouTube, that's where you can find it. If you're over there on either Apple Podcasts or Spotify, I recommend if you want to find our socials, head over to YouTube and give that a watch. Guys, you mentioned it, and last night, at the time that we're recording, it's Wednesday night. This is going to go up Thursday afternoon, so we're going to have another game against Washington, so kind of weird timing for the podcast, but we can talk about that game one against New York. Was an absolute special thing to watch for Celtics fans, obviously, with banner night, being the theme of the night, and it kind of just, you seemed by the end of the final buzzer, you kind of forgot that the Celtics had risen that banner because there was so much excitement surrounding the game, guys. Now there's a lot to talk about from both angles, I think, here, Boston and New York. However, I do want to hear what you guys think, what your guys' thoughts are on just the banner night, the presentation, and just your overall experience in watching that.
Wish I was there. I mean, I should have used my code from SeatGeek for $20 off because I know the tickets were off the chart to get in there. But I know there was some good entertainment going on outside Boston, and I know the atmosphere within the Garden was absolutely bumping. Like I said, I wish I was there to see that banner get risen in person, but and also, TNT didn't do a great job of presenting that as well.
Oh, yeah. They butchered that.
With the commercial right in the middle of it.
Right.
But you could see that the energy wasn't a thing. It wasn't just a celebration for the banner. It was there. The team knew that there was going to be a game after that, and they didn't celebrate just by taking their shoulders off. And they dived right into the game and started taking over. And right off the bat, Jayson Tatum showed his dominance with a 3-point shot right off the tip, and he kept the team from the ceremony until the final buzzer going.
Yeah, I just like the pomp and circumstance of it all. They come out in the white jackets with the gold trim.
Right.
It just looks visually great.
Yeah.
Everyone's being introduced, and it's kind of just this symbolic. It's kind of the culmination of the season from last year. It's kind of like, this is done now. We're on to something new. And I thought
Right.
that was refreshing personally. And Joe Maz steals the show again. I mean, talk about a guy who has really been embraced by Boston after some questions about his competence for a year and a half. He looks like he's about to do push-ups. He kisses the floor. I mean, it was one of those moments that you'll always remember. It's probably the defining moment of the pregame stuff. And then, like Franco said, they came out immediately guns blazing. And I think it was one of those things that last year was awesome. They won the title, but we're on to something new now. We're on to 2025.
I mean, you're so right on the gold jacket. You're sitting there and you're watching it, and you're a grown adult, right? We're all fully grown men now, and there's a little childhood that gets kind of put out there. You grow up, you see guys like LeBron, like Steph, KD. Previously, you've seen Jokic, you've seen Giannis, you've seen all these great players, Kobe, and all of them. Kind of get to celebrate that ring and that banner and wear that gold jacket in front of their home crowd. You're the first game of the NBA season. It's the primetime game. Everyone's watching. And I thought it was a really cool experience as a Celtics fan to get to sit there. And obviously I wasn't fortunate enough to get there live this time around, but it was special. It was amazing. And, I like, how you guys put it, where they came out guns blazing, and it was the perfect start, in my opinion, to a title attack, as Joe Mazzulla would call it. And A lot of things to talk about here, but it would feel wrong if we didn't start with Jayson Tatum himself, because there were a lot of question marks about Jayson Tatum coming into the season from outside noise. We saw him coming off of an NBA championship, have that crazy, wild offseason and summer with the Olympics, in what transpired with Steve Kerr. And, coming into camp, we kind of saw glimpses of what looked like a new form and a smoother and more comfortable shot. We saw a little bit of improvement in the preseason. He shot right around 40% from three, which is phenomenal for Jayson Tatum, phenomenal for really any standards. And then here comes Jayson Tatum out the gate, 37 points, 4 rebounds, 10 assists, 8 of 11 from downtown, guys. He was automatic and really firing on all cylinders. To you guys, was this the most comfortable Jayson Tatum has looked within this offense under Joe Mazzulla?
Definitely. And I think this is one of the first times we've seen him really take the driver's seat of the offense. We've seen him find his place in the role of the offense in past years. He's usually been a playmaker and he's obviously top scoring option. However, when he's starting to create the looks himself and he's trying to find the looks for himself, right, and the offense is going to just flow through him and the hot hand is going to be contagious. And as he's been doing so well over the past few years, he really took advantage of it yesterday. Was being able to find that extra look when the extra defender slides over to him. And he finds that extra wide open or creates wide open 3-pointers, and it created the parade of on the Knicks.
I think it's a little more nuanced than that, because I think throughout, especially the playoff run, he was playing similarly to how he was yesterday. The problem was the shots weren't going in. And when the shots aren't going in and you're taking that high volume of threes, it looks a lot worse. When the shots are falling, it looks a lot better. And I think the playmaking aspect really came alive specifically during the playoff run, but midway through last season, where he kind of figured out that, look, if the shot's not going in, I can do this other element. And I attract so much attention from a defense that everyone else can be involved. And that's what happened last night. There's a play specifically, he came down with his left hand and kind of just shoveled past it to White on the left side. And it's just stuff like that where he's doing these things to get others involved, but they're wide open. It's not just creating good shots, it's creating excellent shots, and it's creating excellent shots to excellent shooters. And I think with Tatum is when he's confident, he's one of the best players in the world. And there's not really an argument about that. It's when he's starting to miss those few shots out of the gate, and then he starts doing the step backs, and then it starts clanking, and then he starts getting frustrated with himself. That's when it can go a little bit sideways. But to me, it's the same guy. It's just better. Like it's the same kind of play style. It just looks a little more refined. And when he's confident, he's able to do these other things that he wasn't doing. To me, one of the things that I was impressive with, I don't know if you guys remember this, about 2 minutes into the game, he went up for a layup and he foul baited so hard against OG Anunoby. He didn't get the call. Anunoby kind of swatted it away, and that was that. And it was just one of those Jayson Tatum plays where you're like, come on, go stronger. It never happened again. He was so much more assertive for the rest of the game. He was going into guys. He wasn't caring if the whistle was being blown. He was just putting the ball in the basket. He wasn't worried about whether or not he was going to get to the free throw line. He was just doing his thing. And I think to me, that's the next element of Jayson Tatum. It's just being calm and playing your own game, because your own game is good enough to be a first-team All-NBA guy and be in MVP discussions.
There's no doubt about that, because his resume speaks for himself. And I think there were a couple of aspects that felt a little bit different. Obviously, the first one, like you mentioned, Xavier, right, is the fact that the shot was falling, right? It looks a whole lot better when you're 8 for 11 opposed to 3 for 11, right? I mean, that's 15 points off the board and in what, 50% off your splits. So there's that. The other element, which you mentioned and I liked, was there was no foul baiting. There was no like kind of this like, I'm a superstar, put me to the free throw line type of mentality that you kind of see out of Tatum sometimes. It was very FU. And we have seen, and I call it FU Jayson Tatum because you've seen it on occasions, and it's every single time you kind of mention a Jayson Tatum highlight signature moment, he was playing with an FU mentality. Now, right off top of my mind, 2022 Sunday afternoon game against Brooklyn. Brooklyn's coming into town. It's a very, very marquee matchup game. Tatum kind of plays with this FU mentality. He goes for 50 in an overtime win against Brooklyn. Another kind of FU mentality moment against Philadelphia in game 7. He came out, he stunk it up through 3 quarters in game 6. He follows it up with a masterclass in game 7. When like Xavier, like what you were kind of saying, it's when Tatum plays pissed off. It is a whole different player than when he's cool, calm, and collected. And I get it. Tatum has been very vocal about being a reserved guy, right? He's calm. He's not going to be like this outspoken, in your face type of guy. And that's fine. But I think what we need to see, and maybe what transpired in the offseason will play into that this year. Tatum needs to, every time he steps on the court, say F you in essentially. And he needs to kind of do what he did last night. And he can do that, obviously, not to the extent of 8 for 11 for behind the arc. I mean, just absurd shooting splits, right? But he is, from an X's and O's standpoint, the ultimate mismatch, the prototypical basketball mismatch. He is 6'9" with long arms, who can shoot the 3 ball, who can play make, who can get to the rim, and he can stop on a dime and pull up from the mid-range area, right? He is essentially a defender's worst nightmare. And he was utilized to perfection on opening night. And I think that is something that needs to be looked at from a Joe Mazzulla scheme type of thing. Because again, we've seen it, but it wasn't as efficient. And we saw it and it looked amazing. And, I think when you look at Jayson Tatum this year, guys, and I'm interested to hear what you have to say, is MVP in the picture? I mean, I know it's one game and we don't want to overreact, right? But with what you saw, is there evidence that can kind of conclude maybe this is Tatum's MVP season?
It would be wrong not to have him in the picture for this year. Definitely the NBA usually looks at PERs and things of that sort when it comes down to it. And what Tatum had last year was all around success with a successful team around him. It wasn't much of the weight of the team was on his shoulders because the team could carry itself around him. This season, he's the one steering the ship, so he's the one controlling at what rate this team can succeed at. They're looking to improve from last season, and Tatum's going to be the defining factor. If he's playing as a point dominant player and trying to find his looks in the offense, and with the FU mentality, as you said, he's going to be able to have those nights that Luka Doncic has or Nikola Jokic has, where the stats are remarkable off the board, and it was a pure dominant night from Jayson Tatum. And it's something that's challenging, especially when you're on such a skilled team, because you want to make sure the payload gets around to everyone, and something that the voters won't account for in MVP. This isn't things of that sort, but I think that Tatum, especially with Kristaps being out for the first half of the season, has a chance to really make his statement that he can be the true number 1 of the Celtics.
I'd say he's on the periphery. I don't think he's in the inner circle, but I think he's on the periphery. I think the problem with him winning the MVP would be the Celtics would likely have to go for some kind of win record, which I don't know if that's possible with Kristaps, assumingly missing the amount of time he's going to miss. I think the problem with Tatum is his second best player on his team is Jaylen Brown. That hurts him in these kind of debates. It shouldn't, but it just does. It's just kind of how it is. I think there might be some voter fatigue with Jokic, but I think a guy like Giannis can put up video game stats and it'll look better for him because his second best player is Dame, and that's a bigger gap. And I think Shea specifically as well, if the Thunder get the 1 seed in the West, I think Shea probably should have had a better argument last year, and I think voters recognize that. And I think if the Thunder win 55-plus games, I think Shea's kind of a shoe-in. So I think he's on the periphery, but it has nothing to do with him. Let's put it like this. He could be the actual MVP. I just don't think he's actually going to win the MVP because of the way the voters kind of have the guidelines for the awards nowadays.
Well, it felt like in prior years, there is a case for Tatum to already have had an MVP caliber season. But there was like this weird, like little like thing being held over his head that the voters were kind of like, like playing around with him. It's like, oh, you got to win the finals first, JT. If you want to win an MVP, you got to win the finals, which is so interesting to me because that dynamic has actually been the complete opposite in the history of basketball in the NBA, where the MVP comes first from a star player and a superstar caliber player. And, with Tatum, I think I agree with what Xavier said in a sense where there's got to be some sort of win record involved. If Boston wins, say 66 games, which I think is honestly, quite frankly, very reasonable from what I've seen last year and what I just saw last night. If they can win like 66 games, 67 games, right? And Tatum is efficiently scoring the basketball. And I'll tell you what, his playmaking numbers, I think they're going to be up very high this year. I think you're going to see in the 8, 7, 8, 9 range from Jayson Tatum, right? Somewhere in there. Not 9 might be very, very high, but you'll definitely see it, I think, elevated from 4, probably around 6, 7. And he can score right around 28, 30 maybe. Again, like Franco said, I agree. It's really difficult for this guy because he's on such a talented team and his numbers aren't going to be Luka Doncic-esque. So it's a weird dynamic this year, but I will say, I think 20 games in, he'll be the favorite, the betting favorite, that is. And he's the betting favorite now, but again, the other guys are just playing their first game right now. So he's got a jump start. So it'll be interesting. And it's something we're definitely going to keep track of this year. And again, you ask many Celtics fans, they're going to say, we don't care. You ask Tatum, he's going to say, I don't care. But it is something worth noting because it feels like Tatum has not gotten his flowers recently. And the other guy, his running mate, Jaylen Brown, I do want to talk about a little bit what we saw at JB. It was, in my opinion, a very classic Jaylen Brown game. Nothing that wowed me, but it was Mr. Reliable. And that's kind of who Jaylen Brown has become for the Boston Celtics, is Mr. Reliable. And a lot of that is what he's been able to do on the defensive floor, guys. So when you look at Jaylen Brown and his kind of unique style of play, where you haven't seen a prototype like Jaylen Brown really since like Dwayne Wade or Kobe Bryant, that 6'6", two-way, very athletic, kind of predominantly scores in the mid-range area, but can't extend behind the three-point line if he's hot. What are your expectations for Jaylen Brown this year? And I guess my question really is, has he kind of officially inserted himself into the top echelon of the NBA?
Most definitely. If he was on, I would say, around 15 other teams in the NBA, that he would probably be the best player on it. I think that if he keeps his consistency, what Jaylen Brown is the quality control for the Boston Celtics. Jayson Tatum can have those great performances. Jayson Tatum can have those nights where he misses 10 shots from the three-point line.
Right.
What you can expect from Jaylen Brown is that he is going to be that focal point that will always keep the team centered and is something that you can always fall back on. I think on the defensive end, it's very apparent, and also on the offensive side, I want him to start getting more involved in slashing, and I think that him being almost a second option to being the playmaker on offense, initiate with the ball, is key, and it's something that makes teams have to pick their poison when it comes to playing against the Celtics. And more likely than not, they're going to choose to focus more on Tatum, which is going to open up a lot more opportunities for Brown.
Which we saw last night. We saw that last night for sure.
Yeah, I forgot he was on the team. I mean, all I've heard about for 24 hours is Jayson Tatum, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I thought Jaylen Brown also played a pretty decent game. I think the thing with Brown is this. You're never going to trust him as much as Tatum, even if it looks better at times. The thing with Tatum is it just visually looks more appealing, and the ceiling is significantly higher. But, and this is the big but, I think Brown has become, if not more consistent, more reliable, especially in big moments. And I think with Brown, the thing that I've liked is he gets a little too ISO happy still, and he does a little spin on one foot and does the flamingo thing and whatnot. But what makes me happy is he's really bought into the offense, I think, more than anyone, because I think the first half of last year, he was the one who, more than anyone else, was sacrificing touches, particularly late in games. And I think throughout the playoffs, you saw him kind of come alive and the team rally around him because they understood his sacrifice. And look, I joked about it, but no one's talked about him this entire time. He just came off Finals MVP and Eastern Conference Finals MVP, and no one's talking about him. And I think the thing that benefits him is that he also has more to prove. It's not just about Jayson Tatum; it's also about Jaylen Brown and proving that he's not just this top 15 guy. I think I had him 15th in the latest DraftKings top 100 rankings. He's a top 10 guy, and I think he's right there. And I think it's just proving that and going up a level and making a first or second team All NBA. He's that kind of guy. And I think for him, it may not matter, but I think deep down, he wants some respect too.
Well, rightfully so. And,
Yeah.
for me, I do think, and maybe this is a hot take, but I do think he got his respect and his stamp of approval from the league with that Eastern Conference Finals and Finals MVP, because, it felt wrong and I've said this in a podcast, but it felt deliberate from the media with awarding him those, because it felt like it was them trying to split the two up from the broadcast, and how it just, the whole thing was weird to me, because it was just very weird, and it didn't sit well with me. And I agree with the concept of Jaylen Brown. I think this guy is a top 12 player in this league. And I think he's better than what Anthony Edwards gives you. And I know that might sound crazy. And I think he's better than what Devin Booker gives you and what Donovan Mitchell gives you, because he's in such a unique spot where if you can put Jaylen Brown on the Minnesota Timberwolves, and I'm going to tell you what, they're going to be just as efficient, just as good defensively, and just as dynamic as what we've seen them. So I agree. I think it's time for Jaylen Brown and Jayson Tatum to kind of get their respect. And I think that's what this season is about for them, is they just came off an NBA championship and they still feel disrespected. And you don't see that in the NBA, and especially in today's media. It is, what can you do for me now? It's a right now media fed driven league. That is why the face of the league has changed so much. So it's a weird dynamic that we're seeing out of Boston right now, but it is very, very, very appealing. Now, I do want to shift gears a little bit, and I want to talk about the Celtics on the defensive side of things and what we saw from them last night, because it was a really weird I call it an outlier game if you listen to the post game show, because it's a game that's not within the margins of reality in a sense of what you're going to see in playoff basketball, as I like to see. It's a game that the numbers are so skewed that they're at the top 1% of what to expect this season. You saw a weird dynamic where Boston was shooting 60% from the floor from three, excuse me. And the Knicks were also shooting 60% from the floor, but yet Boston was up by 30. And it was weird because it felt like Boston wasn't getting stops, but they were. So guys, defensively, who do you guys see? Because I didn't see it last night. I didn't see what I wanted to from a defensive standpoint from Boston. Who do you see as this team's like backbone, and what is their identity, I guess? Because I couldn't find it last night.
Don't know if on the defensive side you have that guy, because they're all so well-rounded, and it's such a versatile team where the defense really sparks a lot of the offense, and we saw that throughout last season time and time again. And on a different night, it could be someone else. Jrue Holiday, it could be the guards. That's one of the conversations. Is it going to be the guards? Is it going to be the wings? Is it going to be the centers who are the focal point of this defense? I think it's going to be matchup based, really. It's going to be whatever top talent that they need to lock down for the night. Whose assignment is that going to be? I think Jrue Holiday, it takes a lot of the key points on that, and I think that a lot of the off-ball work is something that they do a fantastic job of as well.
Right. But I won't lie to you, Franco. I won't lie. And I didn't see that. I didn't see any of that last night. And quite frankly, and I know maybe this is a very negative way to look at things, but I watch the game and I see what I see. if Boston doesn't make 33s, we got ourselves a ball game, in a real good one too, in a ball game in which New York looks very, in favor of. And I get it, right? Yes, if you take, I mean, what Boston was doing on offense was so dynamic, but there's two sides of the ball, and there's going to be a bunch of nights where those shots aren't falling. So, I'd like to see more out of the guards. I think the guards were too easily, uh, you know, uh, we're giving the paint up way too easy. And I don't know, maybe that's a negative approach, but that's kind of just how I saw it.
And I mean, the wings last night were kind of locked down. I was looking at the box score when we were doing the post game show last night.
Right.
Mikal Bridges and Anunoby were almost off the board. I think that Anunoby had around 16 to 18 points last, which is not on what to expect from him, but the defense looks strong on that side. And Bridges or Miles McBride was
Yeah. Oh my God, he was torching us.
he was he was playing a sixth man, a spark plug role for the New York Knicks, and I think he's gonna make drastic steps in improvement and that's an around the hardwood topic. But I think that the Celtics were kind of struggling with the guard play just because they were trying to match him up with Holiday up with Karl Anthony Towns, and then
Right.
would be have to be switching over to Brunson.
Yeah, I guess. But I think the problem is, and we've seen this plenty of times, guards with elite foot speed have given Drew Holiday and Derek White fits. I think of those Thunder games last year, Shea was just doing whatever he wanted, Maxey's specifically. I think it's more just they're incredible defenders against 98% of guys, and this 2% of just the awesome foot speed kind of torches the Celtics, and that is a problem. I think the other thing too is, and not to complain about lineups and whatnot, but look, I like Luke Cornett. He's fine. He's a good, slightly above average backup center. Xavier Tillman is better than him. He always has been. He always will be. And I think I understand Joe Mazzulla's allegiance to Luke Cornett, but specifically defensively, the Knicks were picking on him a little bit in his minutes that he was in. I'd like to see Tillman get down on the block and be the great defender that he was for Memphis. He's a defensive guy, and I think he offers more specifically in pick and roll defense, and he's a better rebounder than Luke as well. And I think that'll come into play soon. I was hoping a full offseason with the team would knock Tillman up a peg in coming off the bench as this backup center, but it's the first game of the season, and I'm not going to read too much into it. I think as far as White and Holiday going forward, it was an unacceptable game. But at the same time, it's the ring ceremony. Most teams lack intensity during that situation, and you understand why. So, look, if that's their lack intensity game on defense, I think they're doing okay.
Yeah, right. No, I don't disagree. And for me, it's more of just like it's not a problem that I'm worried about necessarily for playoffs, because again, when you have Porzingis back in the lineup, it solves all that, because you figure if your guard gets beat, you meet in the paint a 7'3" rim protector. I think for me, my more problem is all right, what's it going to look with Porzingis out of the lineup? Because, Luke and Tillman, as good as Tillman is defensively, he's not an interior presence. He's more of a switchable 4-5 guy that you like to kind of have on a team that spaces, kind of like what we see from New York. But I will say, like, even with Horford, there was one play in the first half that I remember very, very clearly. Brunson was coming downhill. It was a high pick and roll, and it was just a 2 dribble right around Al Horford to get to his left hand and an easy layup. And it was just too easy. And I think that's, because again, this team's not, they're not unbeatable, right? They're still an NBA team, right? And they're still a team that can get beaten on any given night. So I think if we're looking at, all right, what's this team's kryptonite right now with Porzingis out of the lineup, it's getting downhill against this team, because I do think that, again, there's not a lot of rim protection down there. And I think a lot of the focus here on defense is going to be on the guards to keep their man in front of them. They cannot allow, these quicker guards to get downhill and get into the paint.
And I think that's why Brad got Tillman in the first place. And I just want to see more run with him and Kata. And I know Kata's still a little raw. I know Celtics fans love him, and I do too. But he is still a little raw. And I think the foot stuff is a little bit of a concern as far as his lateral mobility. But I
Right.
just want to see him out there a little bit and see what he offers and see what he can do. And Tillman specifically, I know who Luke Cornett is. And I think he's a good option, but I think you have better in house options that you can play around with. And if he's not, he's not. But you might as well try. And I feel like we haven't seen those options enough. And oddly enough, in the finals, Tillman had some awesome minutes that really helped in the middle of those games. And I thought that was kind of the trend. And I think Luke Cornett kind of had his way with him a few times. But still, it's just something I'll be monitoring. But again,
Right.
if you look at the upcoming schedule, it won't really become a factor anytime soon. So it's one of those things that it's going to be a problem, but it's not going to be a big problem in the short term.
Well, that's a kind of a good segue into my next segment and the next question I have for you guys, right? So obviously these next 15 games, things are pretty easy for this Celtic squad. You see Milwaukee once, you see Indiana once, but for the most part, you're seeing the lower caliber teams in this league, especially tomorrow night or tonight. When if you're listening to this on game day, the Celtics will see Washington. And I think this will be kind of a good test run to see what Joe does with this rotation, guys. Now, my question to you, right? Obviously, last night, Joe stuck to his classic 9-man. Pritchard, Hauser, Cornett, and Tillman all got the call off the bench. How deep do you guys see this Celtics team going for a majority of the year against the normal teams and not a Knicks, not a Thunder, not a Sixers?
I think that everyone on the bench should always be ready to be dressed. I mean, I think there's going to be a lot of games like last night that you're going to get a lot of garbage time looks, and I think that fourth quarter you're going to be seeing more Jordan Walsh. They're going to feel a little bit more comfortable with him, and I would be interested to see them try to work him more into in-game situations, feel comfortable putting him in like the second quarter regular season game against the Washington Wizards, or to get him those repetitions while you can. And it's all based off of confidence. We don't want them feeling too overzealous and thinking that every single game that they're going into in the next 15 is going to be a cakewalk, because you still need to make the statement that this is their league. And I think that any loss that the Celtics take will be more under light than years before. They're under a lot more pressure, and it's not really time to mess around and figure things out. But if there is a time to do it, it is in the next couple of games. But I think that we'll see different matchups and mixes on the benches, rotations.
I say this a little sarcastically, but I do mean it. They made the statement last year when they won the title. Like, if they drop a few out of the gate, who cares? But I think as far as the original question, how deep they'll go, I think it'll be about 9 to 10. Depends on the night.
Right.
Walsh, look, I understand everyone wants him to be ready. He's not ready. He's really not. And I understand Bronny James can come in and look like Tobias Harris and go in the corner for 4 minutes and not do anything. But at the same time, anyone can do that on the Celtics. If you have the nucleus that Boston has, you can throw me out there and it'll be fine because everyone else is that good. It'll overcompensate. I think in actual games that means something that aren't 20-point blowouts, you're probably only going to see 8 to 9 guys. And then beyond that, it might just be those like specific Washington games, Charlotte games, blah, blah, blah. That's when you might see a Walsh tried out there. That's when you might see a Jaden Springer tried out there. But again, those games mean significantly less because they're 20-point blowouts within 5 minutes because it's the Celtics. So again, you could really try out anyone and it wouldn't be that big of a deal. But I think we're still a little bit of ways away of Walsh playing actual minutes. He's still deer in the headlights. It looks better. He doesn't look as robotic when he touches the ball. It's not as comical as like he's this stiff guy who moves like this, like a robot, but he still has room to work. And I think with Boston, the bench is solid. It's not great, but it's solid. It's above average for sure. I think we overrated a smidge because of the system it plays in and the guys they play with a lot. But at the same time, I like what we saw yesterday, despite missing threes for 8 minutes. I think they looked comfortable when they came in. And
Right.
in the part of the games that did actually matter, they were moving the ball and playing good offense. It's different when you're just chucking threes for 8 minutes. Who cares? But at the same time, I think Pritchard looked good before that stretch. I think Hauser looked good before that stretch, Tillman, etc.
I think this bench can get deep if you're mixing them in with the starters from how just talented the starters are. I think Jordan Walsh has an opportunity to look a whole lot better with Jayson Tatum and Jaylen Brown standing next to him.
Yeah.
Right. Opposed to like a Sam Hauser. And I agree with
Who
both of
can't?
you. I know, right? I like again, like you said, you could throw me in there, and I think I'd look pretty damn good next to Jayson Tatum. But I mean, like in all reality, right? Against the Wizards, I expect to see the normal 9-8 man rotation until a point where we're probably up by 35, and then you see the guys come in. Is probably how this thing's gonna go. Now, against the Knicks, again, it's going to be the tight 8-man when Porzingis comes back. It'll probably get put to a 9-man matchup based between Kornet and Tillman, like we saw in the playoffs last year. Nothing's changing there. They made that very clear when they didn't bring in Lonnie Walker. Now, like, how deep will I go? I don't necessarily know if Walsh is ready, but I think he can give you some burn, especially on just the athletic defensive end. Like, I think he's long enough and athletic enough to look like an NBA player out there. I don't know if he's polished enough offensively. So that will be interesting. And then Neemias Queta, you saw him last year, and in his time, he did pretty good job. And I think that will be interesting. So it's a very dynamic opportunity for Boston, and I'll be excited to see how it play out tomorrow night against Washington. Now, guys, last segment here, and it's a new one around the hardwood. We got Lakers versus T-Wolves game last night, and I have strong opinions on it, and I'm very interested to hear what you guys have to say about this kind of whole, I want to call it a clown show, what is going on in Los Angeles right now. Now, the Lakers, however, were victorious in head coach JJ Redick's first game as a Laker and new rookie Bronny James. Now, guys, I'm sorry. It feels wrong to talk about this on this podcast because I promise you guys that this is just straight hoops and we dive into the real nuances of the game. But like, can we just acknowledge something that this is crazy, right? Like this LeBron Bronny media train is nuts and shows where the Lakers are at right now, right? Like I'm not crazy for thinking that.
The only thing they have to grasp onto, I mean, Bronny James right now is a certified JD Davison. Think that he is getting these opportunities. And I mean, don't get me wrong, the NBA player and son playing on the same team in any sport or anything is something that should be covered, and especially that it is one of the greatest players of all time. That something that is going to get media coverage. But if you're looking at this as the LA Lakers, you're looking at storylines and appeasing the media as the equivalent to winning basketball games and putting together a good quality team to get LeBron James into another contention battle, because there was no other upgrades to their team.
It's a clown show. It's a clown show.
Dalton Connect, great draft pick. I think he's going to some noise for them just because he has to, because they're one of their only rotational guys and they have to rely on a rookie.
It's not about appeasing the media. It's about appeasing his own desires. I mean, it's all about LeBron. Look, it has nothing to do with Bronny, and nothing about what I'm about to say has anything to do with him. But at the same time, you have to be realistic. And Kenny Smith yesterday was trying to shill for this on live television, saying about how Bronny was a McDonald's All-American, and therefore, if he played well, he would have been drafted. Yes, that is inherently true. The problem was he didn't play well at USC. And you can talk about the hard stuff, whatever. The problem is this. McDonald's All-American does not mean what it meant in 1992. There are plenty of those guys that flame out of college, that transfer after 1 year, that stink. Point blank, period. That's all it is. And he played at a massive high school in Sierra Canyon that helped prop up his game a little bit. and help inflate his ranking anyway. And let's put it like this: if his name was Todd Smith, he would not have been the 20th overall ranked recruit in the ESPN composite. He wouldn't have been. He would have been probably closer to like 70, 80, which is still very good. And no one's acting like it isn't. But it would not be as high as he was, and they can justify that all they want. But we know what the truth is. And I think for these people to say how great it is that it's happening, sure, in a vacuum, I guess it is. But it sets a terrible precedent. Because what happens if Jayson Tatum wins 5 more MVPs and whatnot? And this happens with Deuce. It'll be just as bad. It will be. I'm sorry. And it'd be just as bad if you ran a Tostitos company making corn chips and you promoted the kid all the way to CEO when he was 21 and failed business school. It's just as bad. No matter what walk of life it is, it's bad. It just happens to be significantly worse because it's the NBA and it's on live television. And we all have to pretend that it's this sweet moment when in reality, it's chronic nepotism that shouldn't have happened and that we shouldn't be accepting. And I'm glad, I don't know if you guys saw this, the Michelle Beadle comments. She just completely roasted the entire thing and talked about how gross it was, and it is. And in a way, I feel bad for Bronny because when I'm sitting here talking about this, it has really nothing to do with him because he would do what any of us do. And as far as I want to be in the NBA, I'd want to be out there, I'd want to be playing with my dad. Exactly. That sounds cool. Right. Like he's just doing what he's fortunate enough to be able to doing, but that doesn't mean he should be in that position.
You know, it speaks volume to the Lakers organization as well, because you are the Los Angeles Lakers. You are basketball royalty. You, the Celtics, the Knicks, I know their royalty is a little bit different, but they're historic. They're part of the original 16. I mean, they're historic, right? You are like, it's like the Yankees. And when you think of the NBA, you think of the Lakers. And to see what's transpired last night in this offseason, and to make no improvements, and to hire LeBron James's podcast partner, and to draft his son, and to just play into what is the LeBron James, what feels like the LeBron James farewell tour without him actually saying it. He is taking his desires to own a team, right, when post basketball season, and he's implementing it now into his last couple days, playing days. And I think it's gross. I think that, again, don't ever blame Bronny for this, because he is doing what any 19-year-old kid would do. It's what I would do. And I know if you're listening to this, it's what you would have done, right? Who wouldn't want to go play for the Los Angeles Lakers and their dad? Now, if you're LeBron, you have to and again, I don't want to intrude into their dinner table talks or what's said or their family lives. I don't know anything about it, nor do I really care. But Xavier, you make a great point. This is a kid that averaged 4 points per game at USC coming off the bench. He was not a productive college player. He showed no glimpses of talent and nonetheless NBA talent. We didn't see any of that his freshman year. That's fine, right? We could have seen it his sophomore year, maybe even his junior year. He should have been given that opportunity to improve as a basketball player, because I do believe this guy does have some potential NBA caliber like value. But to bring him in after what was half of a freshman season, and to draft him over some guys that put in the work to their whole lives and were ready to go for the NBA is a little disappointing to me. And I do think it's a clown show, and I'm going to cut it off at that, because I don't, again, I hate talking about stuff like this on the podcast, but it was so big that it felt like it needed to be talked about. So let's get back into the X's and O's, guys. Now, from a Timberwolves perspective, it was a big offseason for them. They got rid of Karl Anthony Towns. They brought in Julius Randle, guys. Now, it looked pretty bad from an offensive standpoint for the Timberwolves. The ball stuck heavily into Julius Randle's hands. Now, in your guys' opinion, did the Minnesota Timberwolves make a mistake by trading away Karl Anthony Towns and acquiring Julius Randle from an X's and O's standpoint? So forget about the money.
I think this trade is going to work out for the Timberwolves more than it's going to work out for the Knicks. I think that the acquisitions in depth in Dante DiVincenzo going alongside Julius Randle is something that benefits Minnesota, and also the fact that Julius Randle is a true power forward, and I think that if he starts to find third or fourth option, being the third or fourth option for the Minnesota Timberwolves, he will be able to find his role better than he did in New York. I think he's a much better fit there, and I think that Karl Anthony Towns is should be listed as a five, but the obviously the Jermaine Gobert didn't pan as well as people were expecting, and I think that the the Timberwolves are going to be one of the more legit contenders, and I think it's just going to come with experience because it is the first game.
I think it's going to suck for both teams eventually. I know you said not to put money involved, but I think Randall having a less year will be involved in this analysis. But regardless, look, it's a clunky fit. It sucks for spacing for Minnesota, and you saw it last night. And I love Dante DiVincenzo. I think he might be the most important part of the entire thing. But at the same time, he's not good enough to be second fiddle to Ant, and neither is Julius Randle. And talk about a playoff dropper. That guy gets in his own head, and I understand it might look better on a few nights, specifically because he's out of that Big Apple media circus, right? He's in Minnesota. It's going to be easier for him to kind of have stinkers once in a while and not be thrust onto the back page of the New York Post and whatnot. But at the same time, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make logistical sense. You're playing two down. You're playing Gobert and Randall. You have Conley, who's an awesome player, but when Conley doesn't have the ball in his hands, no one is able to create offense from Minnesota. Ant's not there yet. Ant is not able to generate offense for his teammates and propel them like a Jayson Tatum was able to transform himself into. I think he will be there soon, but he's not right now. And for the Knicks side of it, Cat's just a catastrophe on defense. And I think if you inverse those guys – and maybe try to get off Gobert, Minnesota had something really special. And guess what? They extended Gobert. What a great idea that was. I don't know who they were bidding against, but they decided that was a good idea. They wanted more Rudy Gobert. But regardless, I just think Randall next to Gobert with Ant at the helm is not going to work. And I think it was a mistake. And we'll see how it works for both teams. I like Minnesota's long-term future regardless because I think they're still malleable and we'll be able to get off some of these guys if it doesn't work out. And Ant is Ant, of course. But at the same time, yeah, I just don't like it for both teams, specifically Minnesota right now.
The vibes from the trade threw me off. It was like Randall didn't want to get traded out of New York and Cat didn't want to get traded out of Minnesota. And the only like common ground that was found here was that Dante DiVincenzo got to stick it to Tibbs in that preseason game. And it just felt weird. It feels unnatural. I watch it and it didn't look right. And still sitting here doesn't feel right. And I think that my initial thoughts on this trade were that it was going to benefit both sides. And I think it could. Again, it's been one game. You got to let time tell, right? I think Franco could be right here. But at the same time, I think there's a good chance that this is a real stinker from both sides and that both sides accomplish nothing. And I think from a New York Knicks standpoint here, acquiring Karl Anthony Towns, I think New York was so consumed by what they saw coming out of Boston in their style of play and what they did and who they brought in that they kind of ignored, right? With this super like wing heavy and we're going to play defense. We're going to space the floor. We're going to shoot like they try to replicate that. And the truth of the fact is that I'm sorry, New Jayson, but you don't have a Jayson Tatum or a Jaylen Brown. And that's what separates you from Boston. And from Minnesota's side of things, I think they were thinking, we obviously financially we can't afford Cat because we know that massive contract we're gonna have to pay Ant and Jaden McDaniels and Rudy Gobert now who you're paying. So it just was just like, okay, New York wants to be a Boston 2.0. Minnesota wants to offload the contract to Karl Anthony Towns. Yeah, sure, this makes sense. And then they did it and they pressed accept. And now they're sitting here a week later thinking, ooh, what? Maybe that made what I'm saying? Where it just felt so unnatural and so forced. And it will be interesting to see what the Minnesota Timberwolves can do. I have less faith in Minnesota than I do in New York in terms of how far they can go. I don't think Minnesota's got the juice this year. I think they take a step back. As for New York, I think New York has just as good of a shot to lose to Boston as any other team does, in terms of seeing them in the Eastern Conference Final, right? I think they got, just they're up there in the league. So it'll be interesting to see. But again, uh, just a weird trade, weird, and just unnatural. So definitely something worth noting. But unfortunately, guys, that is our time here on this week's episode. Now, guys, if you enjoy this podcast, well, believe it or not, after every Celtics game, we go live on our YouTube channel for a post-game show. You can see even more of the crew there on a nightly basis. The podcast guys are rolling strong. This is 2 months in a row now. We got a podcast to you guys every single week. We're on a roll. Very excited with the season starting. There's going to be a lot more to talk about, a lot more special guests, a lot of fun, guys. Again, if you're not following us already on social media, go do that right now, guys. Links are down below. I'm Rob, Franco, and Xavier, guys, from all of us here over at Celtics Talk Weekly. As always, go Celtics.